What are some other issues that are maybe in contemporary Bach scholarship that are currently in dispute, or what are some archival issues that we're currently exploring that help us get a better picture of this piece?
Well, basically, everything that has been said about the B minor Mass, the entire current discussion is something, it's just hypothetical, and we are in the uncomfortable position that we know we constantly realize that we know very little about the B minor Mass. And there are a number of different scenarios. George pointed out the connection to Leipzig, the connection to Dresden is also possible. The connection to Vienna is something that also has come up recently. I think for the time being, it is wise to keep all options open. I think we constantly need to look for new evidence to get something where we can get into the unknown, and maybe someday we will have a better understanding of why Bach in his last year focused on this piece, why he wanted to finish it by all means, and what the piece means actually.
Now, with scholars, the three of you have looked closely at the autograph score, and maybe you could each one tell us what the score brings to your scholarship by looking at Bach's own, what's called P180, the autograph score. What can we learn from that as far as how the Mass was written? And I think, George, you made the point that maybe the Mass should be considered an unfinished work in a sense, because we don't have the parts for the latter parts. And so that's another issue, the original parts along with the score. What can they tell us?
Well, it would be nice to have the parts, especially the parts for the credo, from the credo to the Dona Nobis Pacem. We do have parts for the Kyrie and the Gloria from Dresden, and they tell us a great deal about the performance of the piece and include nuances that Bach generally added only when he moved to performance parts, like the realization of the continuo part or parts. Is there a bassoon? What's its role, etc. The score itself, no one knows that score better than Peter Volney here, so maybe he can tell us about some of the things he found, especially with this participation of Johann Christoph Friedrich Bach. But the one thing I want to say personally, the most moving part of the score to me is the credo section. And looking at the autograph of the credo, this was what Bach started to compose, we assume, when he decided to write a complete Mass, a Missa Tota. And he was in his prime, he had his full strength. He casts it in the 5-part vocal style of Dresden, the same parts he had used for the Kyrie and the Gloria. And he has all his energy at that moment. And when we look at the score of the credo in particular, we see these extraordinary compositional changes that he carries out right in that score. So for instance, the credo, Patrem Omnipotentem, the first two movements, we see that he goes in and he changes the text of the Patrem to include a credo cry. And this is a late compositional endeavor, or a second thought compositionally. And then he decides to write an Incarnatus, and so he inserts that into the score, and then he retexts the Et in Unum Dominum, and then he decides to add an introduction to the Crucifixus, and then he revises this bridge to the Et Expecto. Extraordinary compositional work. And he must have carried it out because he felt that he wanted to turn this dry formulaic text into something live and dramatic, and he does. And these changes all concern transitions and unities and ideas that will make this a dramatic whole. So to me, the credo portion is worth the $500 cost of the new facsimile edition alone, just to look at these and ponder Bach's thoughts as he worked on this section. And then with the Sanctus and the remaining sections, it's a bit different. You don't see that kind of important, fundamental compositional activity?
Yeah, very similar kind of responses. And the only thing I would sort of add to that is that some of those revisions and rethinking and so on, I wouldn't go quite so far as to say struggling, but certainly there's a high level of engagement there that seems very special in the credo. And I see that as, I find it very interesting that the places where many of the places where the new music that's specifically composed for the Mass in B minor and is not arranged from an earlier vocal work, that those in fact turn out to be the places in the credo that beliefs that would be projected by the relationship between the musical setting and the text are the most powerfully Lutheran, as it happens. So to give a very simple example would be that the adding of the new version of the Et Incarnatus Es gives an absolutely spectacular depiction via borrowing musical styles from Pergolesi that was designed originally to express the sorrow of Mary at seeing her son dying on the cross, is now transferred over to the discussion of Jesus being born of the Virgin Mary. What this ends up expressing then is the notion that Mary will have experienced pain in childbirth. And that's a fundamental, it's not a super important thing, I'm not saying that, but that is something that Lutherans and Roman Catholics specifically disagreed on. That Lutherans' belief was that Mary was indeed infected, as it were, with original sin like everyone else. And in the Catholic tradition, Mary does not have the stain of original sin. And as a logical consequence of that, she does not experience pain in childbirth, the so-called curse that God brought on humanity in the Hebrew Bible. So to depict Mary as some people even hear as the displacement of the dissonances at great intervals in the Visa, it's almost like a harmonic depiction of contractions in birth. I don't know if I'm prepared to go quite that far, but I would say that where the masses of Zelenka and Hasse and so on have very mystical, beautiful, it's always a special section when in the Mass, in the Dresden Masses, when you get to that part of the text. And it seems at first as if Bach forgot to do something special there if he was going to be part of this tradition. And so he does insert something special in there that's very mystical and strange sounding and so on. But in the process of doing so, whether he deliberately does or he just can't help himself, he depicts it in such a way that it brings not only mystical properties into it, but pain into it. I don't hear the pain in Zelenka and Hasse and the contemporaries, and I think that's one really clear sort of example of bringing Lutheran thought into the musical setting of the credo. The same sorts of thing you see that the Confidior towards the end of the credo appears to have been composed specifically for this polyphonic setting of the credo, and there we don't have time to go on to the details of it, but there are specific Lutheran doctrines about baptism, and that's the part that's being talked about there. And the way that Bach sets that up musically is a way that I don't believe a Catholic composer would ever do, because it has the effect of projecting the idea that the effectiveness of baptism lies not in the authority of the Church to effect that sacrament for you, but in the acknowledgement of belief. The word Confidior is said over and over and over and over and over again and superimposed on the baptismal part to make it very clear that what makes baptism effective is in fact acknowledgement of faith and so on. It's not a huge big deal, and I'm not saying that a Roman Catholic listener, if they ever noticed it, they might not even notice it. But if they did, they wouldn't be offended by it. I'm just saying it's not something that Zelenka probably wouldn't do that just because that's not the way he thinks about baptism, that sort of thing. But the beauty is, as I say, that you can sort of trace some of the most interesting places in the manuscript are the most interesting musically, and also the most interesting religiously. So I think it's really nice that all three elements sort of are so closely related to each other. The one other thing I did want to say, though, is that I also very much like the fact that Bach divided the whole piece into four sections, not into 5. And they're numbered by him, and they have these nice little things at the beginning. It has the little letters J, Jesu, Juve, Jesus help me as I work on this. And at the end of the section, they'll say SDG, glory to God alone. So that all of the musical exploration, without taking anything away from that, the intense interest in musical exploration is in the service of promoting a particular, or I should say a general viewpoint of what I think he takes the Mass to mean.
For me, I couldn't agree more with George. The Credo section is the most interesting musical manuscript we have in Bach's hand that can help us understand the complicated genesis of the piece. For example, a number of people, including me, have been trying to figure out entries in different hands. Later entries, Joshua Rifkin and I, we first focused on entries by C.P.E. Bach, and it turned out that C.P.E. Bach, who had the score in his possession after 1750, was apparently intrigued by the piece and made little changes, corrections, revised it. He even performed sections of the B minor Mass late in his life. There also may be entries in the hand of Johann Christoph Friedrich Bach, which, if this is true, could point to the fact that Bach in 1749 had parts prepared that perhaps were sent somewhere, but so far haven't turned up or don't survive anymore. Bach's own entries, the revisions were mentioned that he made, very important changes. Not everything has been explained satisfactorily so far. You can spend hours just on looking at the 4 title pages of the 4 sections and figure out new things. For example, that Bach originally in 1733 had a 5-part chorus in mind, and Kyrie and Gloria are composed in that way. He took the idea up in the Credo, but somehow within the course of completing the Missa Tota, apparently he ran out of time, and first decision he made is he took the Sanctus of 1724, which is a 6-part setting, so actually doesn't fit there. One could interpret this in the direction that Bach had a commission to deliver a Missa Tota at some point, started composing, started to revise older movements and whatever, but then run out of time and just finished it quickly. This doesn't mean that the music is not that good anymore. I mean, the last movements belong among the most moving parts of the entire piece, but somehow it may at some point tell us or lead us into a direction where to look for further evidence.
Where is Bach scholarship going now, and where would you like to see it in 5 years?
Well, that's, I think, a good question for the director of the research wing of the Bach Archive.
Well, I would hope that Bach scholarship is able to progress in the variety of different approaches as we see it today. So I would hope that analytical, interpretative, and also source critical studies will proceed, and I would also hope that there is a continuing dialogue between the different disciplines within Bach research.
Yeah, I'd like to hope that we could find out more about the day-to-day life in Leipzig and his day-to-day life. For instance, one thing that's always intrigued me is that he gave concerts, gave organ concerts, and we think during fair times he may have played the organ, let's say in the university church for guests, because Schwanenberg describes seeing him play. And so how did he advertise that? How did you know that he was going to play? I mean, something as simple as that, because they're not newspaper advertisements for that type of concert. So how did they spread the word in Bach's time? But many day-to-day things like that we don't know much about. And Andrew Tolley, who's here, is exploring some of those things by investigations of diaries and so forth from the time. And I think that would be an interesting avenue.
Yeah, that's of course something that has been on our minds for many years. What we like to achieve is to get a vivid impression of day-to-day life in the 18th century. And we would like to know how these people lived and what stimulated composers like Bach to produce all these masterworks.